Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Sheldon Richman about NATO. Mr. Richman is the author of Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families, Your Money or Your Life, Why We Must Abolish the Income Tax, and America's Counter-Revolution, The Constitution Revisited. He is also the author of the recent article, The Real NATO Problem, Not Who Should Fund It, but Why It Even Exists. You can follow his work at the Free Association blog, which can be found at sheldonrichman.com. You can find him on Facebook under Sheldon Richman and on Twitter at Sheldon Richman. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/NATO. Sheldon, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you, Adam. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for joining me. So let's start with a very simple definition, and then we'll get into some of the background and some of the changes and current issues and whatnot. But let's just start out with the basic question of what is NATO?
Well, NATO stands for, it's an acronym, it stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was established at the end of World War II by the United States and its European allies. And the ostensible purpose of NATO was to counter what was regarded as a threatening, expansionist Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, was an ally of these same countries during World War II against Nazi Germany and Hitler. And the Soviet Union bore the brunt of that war. It lost something like 20 million people, suffered horribly, and did a great deal to roll the Nazi army back. And the Nazi, people who have, of course, studied World War II will recall from their studies that in 1941, after having signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, Hitler and Stalin had entered into this pact. Hitler changed his mind, and in 1941, June, I believe, attacked the Soviet Union. So the Nazi army had moved eastward and was, of course, wreaking terrible havoc in Central and Eastern Europe, and then went into the Soviet Union to have the vicious battle of Leningrad, terrible, many deaths. But then the Red Army rolls the Nazi army back and makes a major contribution, some people say the major contribution, to defeating Nazi Germany. And of course, the Red Army then was in Eastern Europe as a result of rolling back the Nazis. And so at the end of the war, it was in the countries which later then, or very soon, became the Warsaw Pact. This was the old Czechoslovakia, Poland, all the countries that made up the Soviet alliance system, So this NATO was pitted then against the Soviet Union and the friendly regimes in Eastern Europe. So that's where NATO started. So I'll stop there because you'll probably want to ask another question now.
Yeah, sure. Who were the original NATO members, and how did NATO's membership and purpose change from the time of its founding through the Cold War and up until the fall of the Soviet Union? Sure.
The original members, I'm looking at a list here, so they're alphabetical order, but Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, United Kingdom, and the United States. So that was in 1949. In the early 50s, Greece is added, and then 1955, Germany, that would be the West Germany, of course, because Germany was divided as a result of World War II until later on, which we'll get to. So West Germany is incorporated in 55, and so that things stay pretty much that way for the next 30 years or so. Spain comes in 1982, so there's no real big change there. The Cold War, of course, is still on as of 1982, but then things really change in 1989, and that's when the things are really starting to break up in the Soviet bloc. The Warsaw countries the Warsaw Pact countries begin, in places like, there's liberalization in what is still Czechoslovakia and other places, and the wall, the famous Berlin Wall, which was put up in the early 60s to keep people in East Germany, keep them from crossing over into West Germany, comes down, and starting around 1989. So the Warsaw Pact basically falls apart, disbands in 1989, and there's free passage. People are able to then go from the east to the west through the border between East Germany and West Germany, and that's the game changer. You have Gorbachev as head of the Soviet Union at that point, but he's showing more and more willingness to cooperate with the West, and you have this whole warming going on, this warming of relations and loosening up within the Soviet Union, and then formally in 1991, around Christmas, the Soviet Union basically goes out of business. The hammer and sickle flag comes down from the Kremlin for the final time, and the Soviet Union is no more, and this is accomplished, and this is really significant because I don't think anyone really expected this to happen, basically without a shot. I mean, there's some violence in Romania where the dictator and his wife, I think, are executed, but there's very little bloodshed in the Soviet Union itself. I don't think there's any bloodshed. So it's an unbelievable thing because, I was born the year NATO came into existence, 1949, and my generation figured the Soviet Union was, could be there forever in one way or another, and that the Cold War was just a permanent fixture of life. And here in 1989 to 91, it just all changes and it's gone. Now you would think at that point, with the Warsaw Pact gone and the Soviet Union gone, that NATO could be disbanded. After all, it was set up ostensibly as a defensive alliance against an expansionist global ideology, right? Bolshevism, communism, Marxism, that was supposed to be had designs on the whole world to bring world revolution, socialist revolution to the world. I'm giving sort of the main line version of events. I think things are much more complicated. Whatever the Soviet rulers' desires might have been, capabilities were far different. In other words, they never had the power to conquer the world, and even if they, in some ideological way, dreamt of that doesn't mean it's an actual threat, but that's something we don't need to get too deeply into. The point is the Soviet Union goes away, the Warsaw Pact goes away. Why did NATO go away? Now, a very interesting thing happens under George H.W. Bush. This is George W. Bush's father, George Herbert Walker Bush, who succeeded Reagan becomes president in 1989, key time. He and his Secretary of State, James Baker, make a guarantee in 1990 to Gorbachev that they strike the following deal, or basically put it in the form of a promise. They say to Gorbachev, if you permit the reunification of Germany, don't forget, Germany was divided. Half of it was in the Soviet camp, half was in the American camp or the Western camp. It was a very critical country, obviously. The deal was Germany will be reunified without objection or interference by Gorbachev. And Germany also will be, as a unified country now, will be in NATO, because don't forget West Germany was in NATO. So now all of Germany will be in NATO. That's the kind of thing that would make the Russians nervous. But the promise is you allow this, Mr. Gorbachev, and we will not move NATO 1 inch, and this is even the term they used, 1 inch eastward toward Russia. And Gorbachev said, okay. That sounded like some sort of possible recipe for stability and peace in Europe. The Cold War was finally over. They've come to some accommodation, allowing Germany to be reunified. The Russians always had historical reasons to be worried about Germany, right? Germany invaded Russia in World War I and invaded them again in World War II. I mean, there's historical concerns there, but this deal is struck. And then it's almost immediately violated. The promise is broken.
Right. So why was that promise broken, and why is NATO still around and growing? And how did NATO's role and significance change with the end of the Cold War?
Well, you ask a question that we can kind of speculate about because they don't. The people who are responsible for the expansion of NATO and the mission creep or the mission change of NATO don't always put in writing what it is they're believing, or they put something in writing which is not exactly their belief. But so it was put in terms of bringing nations into the liberal capitalist world, and this would be good for prosperity and peace. And there was even talk under George H.W. Bush that maybe Russia one day could join NATO, which seems kind of ridiculous because if Russia's in NATO, why is there NATO? It seems kind of funny. But of course, that might have just been talk. Nothing happened. But in the meantime, the Warsaw countries, all the Warsaw Pact countries were brought into NATO beginning in 1999. So now we're already into there's talk about it before Bush leaves office. Bush leaves office because Clinton beats him in 1992. But even before Bush leaves, they're talking about expansion. And then when Clinton comes in, that continues. I mean, Clinton's foreign policy is not a break with the Republicans or George H.W. Bush. And so in 1999. And these things take time, so it's being talked about before 1999. But formally in 1999, the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, of course, peacefully breaks up, and you have Slovakia and the Czech Republic. But Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Poland, three major countries of the Warsaw Pact, join NATO. So this is very significant. Now, why? Like I said, in public, they'd say the planners, the U.S. policymakers would say, because they're just being brought into the liberal order. This would be the way to promote peace and prosperity, bring them into the liberal capitalist order. What I think really is going on there, and again, we don't have a smoking gun or papers that spell this out, but I think if you can piece things together and look at different policies over many years, what you have are this American view that America is exceptional. We often hear the term American exceptionalism, which means America needs to lead the world if there's not going to be, they would say chaos and war. But that means there can't be any rivals. There cannot be significant rivals to American interests, which are seen in a global way. As far as access to resources, we have to make sure, this is how they would think about it. We have to make sure, meaning the United States has to make sure we have no serious rivals for access to resources because, why? Because we're the glue that holds the world together. That's the mentality. It's not so much a fear of war from Russia. I don't think anyone thought Russia was going to attack, certainly not after the fall of the Soviet Union. No one thought Russia was going to attack Eastern Europe. But they would talk in ways like, we have to make sure, there is no other power. So it was the time of a single superpower, a unipower world. And so that's why they wanted to do this, by bringing these countries in, making them dependent on the U.S., just getting them to be thinking of now they're part of the U.S.-led bloc. And one of the a key important thing here is, and I think this is where Trump really goes wrong. Donald Trump, of course, has been talking about NATO. One time called it obsolete. He seems to have taken that back now. But he makes it seem like the U.S. is doing a big favor to the NATO countries, the other members, and that they're not paying their fair share, right? They're not spending enough on the military defense, and we're protecting them, so we're doing them this big favor. I think that misconceives what the real story of NATO is. And that story is this. The U.S. needs a cover, an internationalist cover for its activities, because if it's just the U.S. acting alone, that looks arrogant, and that breeds resentment and resistance. People don't like an arrogant superpower, unchallenged in the world, going around working its will, which the U.S. planners have wanted to do. Look what they've done in the Middle East. Look what they used to do very overtly in South America, Latin America, overthrowing countries. So they did it in Iran in '53. They overthrew a nationalist, a left-of-center nationalist prime minister, and put in a brutal dictator monarch which led to the 1979 revolution and the Ayatollah and all the problems that have followed since. So the U.S. planners have roamed the world thinking, basically we own the world. Not that they want to be a colonial overlord in the old style, but they wanted allegiance from basically everybody, and they couldn't tolerate non-alignment. They didn't like unaligned. When the Soviet Union still existed, they didn't even like non-alignment, much less countries that were leaning toward the Soviet Union. So that's what NATO was about. It was to give an internationalist flavor, a multilateral flavor, to America's designs on the rest of the world. It wanted to be the leader, and so those countries weren't doing a favor. The U.S. was not doing a favor for those countries. Those countries were doing a favor for the United States, and so that's why I think Trump has it backwards. All this, of course, was seen and still is seen as threatening by the Russians. You have to look at Americans are very bad at looking at their policies from the eyes of the people on the other side. So all you need to do is imagine if the Russians were forming an alliance with Canada and Mexico and stationing troops and holding war games, war exercises off the U.S. waters or in Canada or in Mexico. American politicians would be going bananas, and they would be whipping up fear of the Russians having designs on the United States. Well, this is how they see what the U.S. has done with NATO ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, and it was designed almost. It was as if it was designed to cause a leader like Putin to emerge, a strong man, right? Who's basically like someone who could say, "We're not going to take this anymore. We've been pushed around," because they were pushed around. After Gorbachev leaves, you get Yeltsin. Yeltsin had an alcohol problem. He was taken advantage of. The economy was stripped, and assets were given to oligarchs supported by the West. U.S. and non-governmental organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy meddled in that country and in former Soviet allies to bring about favorable conditions for their own interests, and sometimes putting rulers or helping to get rulers in power. All this is viewed by somebody like Putin and the Russians in general as, hey, we're being taken advantage of. Instead of there being some sort of peaceful accommodation now since the end of the Cold War, instead they're just taking advantage of us and doing, spiking the ball in the end zone, saying, we won, now we can do whatever we want. No wonder somebody like Putin comes along and says we're not going to put up with this. So that's what I think is going on right now.
Sure, and we'll return to the subjects of Trump and Putin and Russia in a moment here, but I want to return to the NATO membership. Now, based on what you said, we can understand why NATO is so important to the U.S. government and the establishment here in the U.S. and why the U.S. Is a part of it. But what incentives do other NATO members have, from the original founding members of NATO up through the Baltic states and Poland and Slovakia and the Czech Republic and some of the more recent NATO members? What incentives do they have, and have they had, to join NATO? And what resistance have we seen from NATO members and potential NATO members over the years?
Well, I don't think we've seen a whole lot of resistance. France in the 60s, de Gaulle was resentful, and at one point actually got out of the military side of NATO. There is a sort of a political side as well, which he didn't leave. They didn't give up their membership completely, but he withdrew his own troops, and he expelled from France all non-French NATO troops. So there was little resistance there. They rejoined later on, a good deal later, long after de Gaulle died. Germany has been somewhat resistant to bringing in some of the former Soviet satellite countries or republics. I mean, there's been talk for a long time now about bringing Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, which would be very, very provocative. I mean, these are countries that historically are close to Russia and were Soviet republics, not even just satellites or allies, but actual republics. And Germany has, as I understand it, has opposed that inside. And while there's still talk about that now and then, and it's probably still on the table in some sense, it's not being discussed publicly very much right now. I guess they figure it's not a very good time to be talking about bringing Ukraine and Georgia in. But that would be very provocative, and they're already in sort of a pre-membership status. There's something like called a Partnership for Peace, or something where you sort of begin the process of eventually becoming a member of NATO. But what you asked, what the NATO members get out of it? Well, given the influence of the United States, the power of the United States, the economic power of the United States, a lot of politicians understand that it's good to be on the in the good graces of the United States. So you may get some resistance behind the scenes, that things may get opposed that the U.S. wants, but ultimately they go along. So I think that explains why countries want to be in NATO. Look, some of them that are closer to Russia may be worried about Russia just because of historical reasons. Some of those countries were part of Russia, pre-Soviet Russia. Those empires have shrunk and grown over the centuries. Poland used to include much more than it does today, and so there's historical distrust and worry. So I can understand that some people closer to Russia would say that we'll get some security being in NATO and being close to the United States. But of course, as has been pointed out by lots of people, including George Kennan, who was a distinguished diplomat and actually author of the original containment policy after World War II. He died several years ago, but in 1998, when the Senate had just approved the addition of Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland into NATO, he said this was going to be very provocative. It was going to restart the Cold War. It could end in a hot war. And that who actually believes that the United States would want to go to war, or the American people would go to war for, Hungary or Poland or Czech Republic? And you can ask, that question seems even stronger if you talk about the countries further east, which then went into NATO later, because you had additional countries going in with George W. Bush: Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, the Baltic countries, which were Soviet satellites. They're now all in NATO. But would the American people want to go to war, and possibly a nuclear war, for Estonia? Can they find Estonia on the map? I mean, so the question is, by bringing all these countries in, they may feel they're getting some security out of it, but really, are they? Hasn't the U.S. extended guarantees it can't possibly, uphold? That's the big question. Does anybody seriously think, and do the Russians think, that if the Americans are going to go to war for Estonia or Lithuania or Latvia?
So, under what circumstances in the past have we seen NATO members go to war, whether it be for actual defense of NATO members or for more aggressive actions outside of NATO member countries?
I think the only examples are Afghanistan, where the U.S. did that under the guise of NATO. And again, I think that shows my earlier point that NATO has been an umbrella under which an otherwise unilateral action by the United States, which is illegal from the standpoint of international law, the UN's bylaws, can present a unilateral action as if it were actually a multilateral international action. And then the NATO was also the Libya intervention was also a NATO operation, which of course changed in mid-course, because originally the excuse for going into Libya in 2011 was that Gaddafi was going to wipe out the people of Benghazi. There was no evidence for that. Lots of people at the time said he hasn't done anything like that in wiping out other rebel strongholds. He didn't go in and just mow down everybody in towns and cities. So there was no reason to believe this was going to happen in Benghazi. But and that operation, which was an air operation, turned from protecting Benghazi to regime change. Originally, it was not promised as a regime change operation. It was not announced to be a regime change operation. It was just to be a no-fly zone and a safety for the people of Benghazi. So I think those are the only two formal. I take that back. In the late 90s, of course, under Clinton, you have the bombing of Kosovo and Bosnia in opposition to Serbia, which was a traditional Russian ally. So here again are actions that are seen as provocative from the Russian point of view, that its traditional ally Serbia is being bombed, and countries are being, or areas are being, secessionist movements, I should say, are being aided by NATO and the United States, which is, from the Russian point of view, is provocative. The point being that Russia historically has had a sphere of influence, and the U.S. now was not recognizing it and interfering with it, and yet the Americans, of course, are very, very jealous whenever it believes its sphere of influence is encroached on, and the U.S. claims a very large sphere of influence compared to what the Russians claim. Because look at the U.S. and all through Latin America, South America, and all through the Middle East and other places, far beyond its shores, far beyond its borders. Those things, the U.S. has acted as if those were its spheres of influence.
All right, and you alluded to this earlier without referring to it by this name, but Article 5 of the NATO treaty has been in the news, or at least discussed here and there in the news a lot recently, particularly with some of the tragic terrorist-related incidents in France and Belgium. What exactly is Article 5 of the NATO treaty, and when have we seen it invoked in the past?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's been invoked. It's essentially the idea that an attack on one member of NATO is an attack on all. So that's the famous clause of NATO. It's usually the point of an alliance, right? Attack on one member is an attack on all. That's the idea. It's a collective defense alliance. To get a little more specific about Article 5, there's nothing automatic about it. It doesn't say that if a NATO member is attacked from outside, that all other NATO members then have to come to the defense. It says the other member states shall take actions as deemed necessary. I think that's a loophole because what's deemed necessary? You can always say, well, I didn't deem actual military mobilization as necessary. So it's not this sort of ironclad automatic clause. But the idea is that if, it's like a family, right? If you attack one member of my family, you've attacked my whole family. That's the theory. That's supposed to, deter anybody from attacking any member of NATO. Now, I don't believe it's ever been invoked because I don't know that a NATO member has been attacked, at least, or that it was regarded as a justification for invoking Article 5.
Okay, I may be wrong about this, but I thought it was invoked after 9/11, and that's the one instance of it being invoked.
Well, maybe that's why they were able to get NATO to go to Afghanistan.
Right.
Of course, that wasn't a state attacking Afghanistan. The government of Afghanistan did not attack the United States on 9/11. So that's possible. It's possible that I'm forgetting that, but it's not something it's not something.
These attacks in France and Belgium have not been state-sponsored attacks either, and yet Article 5 has been brought up there. Right, and that makes it less clear-cut because these are you're right. They weren't state. They certainly not only not state-sponsored, they certainly weren't state-executed. I mean, it wasn't a government of a country attacking France or Belgium or one of the other NATO members. Right. Yeah, I suppose state executor would be the better phrasing there. But I want to turn to what Donald Trump has had to say about NATO, because he has taken a lot of heat for his comments. So what sorts of criticisms has he made, and where is their merit, and where's he wrong in his criticisms?
Well, you got to remember, as usual, Donald Trump, you never get any sort of systematic, sustained argument or discussion. He's like the king of the one-liner, and I think a lot of times it's an attempt to get media attention or just stick a thumb in the eye of the establishment he claims to be running against. So it's rather scattered and inconsistent. So a few months ago, he made the startling comment that NATO is obsolete because it's not fighting terrorism. That's a little odd because it went into Afghanistan. He didn't seem to know that in 2001 that was a NATO operation. And maybe you could count the 2011 Libya intervention. So he didn't. So he branded it as obsolete because the Soviet Union is gone and the new threat is terrorism. Then he also complained about the free rider problem. See, under under the NATO rules, if you're a member, you are supposed to spend at least 2% of GDP on the military, and I think most of the states don't do that, although that's I think beginning to change. I think there's been some increase in some of the states in Europe. And I think Estonia may be, one of the few countries that spends 2%. So he's been complaining, which is a good populist message, right? These countries are free riders. We're pledging to protect them, and they're not paying their fair share. Sometimes he makes it seem like it's dues to NATO, but it's not dues to NATO. It's 2% of their budget, of their GDP on their own military. So then he gave during the convention, the Republican convention, he gave an interview to the New York Times, where he was probed a little more on this, and they said, well, would you come to the defense of Estonia, or they named some countries, some of the newer NATO members, the ones closer to Russia, and he said, no, sorry, it was kind of the other way around. He said, would you come to the defense of other NATO members? And he said, if they paid if they were paid up, then yes, implying that if they weren't paid up, then no or maybe no, which outraged everybody, and that's been causing comment ever since. However, he's then said things, and like I said, that's an example where I think he misses the point of the true nature of NATO. It's not that we're doing them a favor, the members a favor, by promising to come to the defense. They're doing the U.S. a favor by giving an internationalist or multinational umbrella to what would otherwise be unilateral American activity. So I think he misses that point. But then in his speech the other day, his foreign policy speech, he was talking nicely about NATO again. He said he was glad to see NATO is interested in terrorism now, and he actually tried to claim credit because they've opened some kind of office that deals with terrorism, but that was in the works for a long time before I think Trump was even running for president. So this is nothing, but he was taking credit for it. And then, so he didn't sound like he was against NATO in the latest speech. Don't forget, that was just this week. So you can't keep up with him. You have to. It's like some places where if you don't like the weather, wait 15 minutes, it'll change. The same thing with Trump. I don't know exactly where he stands on NATO, but the last time he talked about it, he seemed to be okay with it.
Right, yeah, he'll take 10 sides on every issue, and then he'll claim credit if one of those 10 things plays out. And on the subject of the 2% spending requirement, some have identified Greece's decision to go along with that as a factor in their economic and monetary woes. So, regardless of what he thinks of the funding of NATO, even if the free rider problem was legitimate and fulfilled, there are other consequences and other problems that go along with that.
Sure, that's true. And the European countries have problems with the burden of their welfare states, and so they're contending with debt and other problems. And Greece was the most egregious example, but there are other examples. I think Italy and others, similar problems are predicted for the not too distant future. And so that's right. Those politicians have to juggle a lot of things. Trump would be on sound ground if he said the U.S. should not be engaged in collective security. When NATO was being proposed and talked about and debated in the United States, one of the leaders against it was Robert Taft, who was known as Mr. Republican. He was the senator from Ohio and who aspired to run for president in 1952. He lost the nomination to Eisenhower. But he was regarded as the leader and hero of what was known as the old right in those days. And these were these weren't conservatives the way we think of them today. These were guys who were anti-militarist. They did not want the U.S. to be the policeman of the world. And their argument against collective security was, for one thing, why should the American people be pledged to go to war because war breaks out somewhere else in the world? I mean, why should Americans be marched off if X attacks Y? The other thing is that when you have those kinds of guarantees, and if they're actually fulfilled, you turn up what could stay and what could start out as a local war into a possible global conflagration. In other words, you widen the war and you increase the misery and the death and the bloodshed and the destruction. And we've seen things like that. the idea is to keep the wars as local and small as possible and not join in. And so that was the old right Republicans' opposition to things like NATO. Also, it goes back to Washington's warning against entangling alliances. I mean, he made similar warnings in his farewell address, and that used to be part of the American psyche. You know, the idea that we should be wary of entangling alliances because you could get dragged into conflicts which are not really in your interest, but if you've made guarantees, then you might have to go along. And this it was just seen as a bad idea. It got forgotten really especially after World War II.
Sure. So before we wrap up, I want to turn our attention to Russia, and you hit on some of this earlier, but obviously there's been a lot of saber rattling, shall we say, both ways, with Russia accusing NATO members of aggression, of course, with the NATO expansion up to Russia's border and some of the war exercises right up against Russia's border. And then there have been claims by NATO members and by NATO officials and leaders that Russia is being aggressive. They'll often cite the purported Russian invasion in eastern Ukraine or the Russian annexation in Crimea, or even the Georgian War, I suppose, to a lesser degree from 2008, when they make claims of that nature. What should we make of all of these claims back and forth between NATO officials and Russian leaders of aggression from one side against the other?
Well, I'm not going to say anything positive about Putin. I'm not a fan of Putin. I don't think he's Hitler, the way I think Hillary Clinton called him. I don't think he's the autocrat or dictator that he's made out to be. He doesn't have absolute power. But on the other hand, he's an authoritarian. I think you have to see him sort of the Russian tradition. I don't think he's something new. Russia doesn't have a liberal democratic tradition. I think you can't look at Putin outside the context that we've been discussing. This movement of NATO all the way up to the Russian border, the stationing of troops. I mean, there are going to be like 4 battalions basically permanently stationed in the Baltics and Poland. Why wouldn't he see that as threatening? This putting missile defenses in one of the countries, again, fairly close to the Russian border. And missile defenses, which sound defensive, can also be offensive, right? They can be your shield while you engage in offensive action. So the fact that they're called defensive missiles I don't think gets NATO off the hook. And then if you look at Ukraine in that context, I mean, after all this has happened, we can talk about Georgia in a second, even though it came earlier. Ukraine, you have the U.S. and again with these so-called non-government organizations which had pulled off these color revolutions in the former Soviet allies and republics. In other words, helping to get hand-picked rulers in, resulting economic corruption, selling off of assets and things like that. And then you have a pro-Russian president in Ukraine, who's then basically driven from office by demonstrations and other kind of activities that are actively promoted by the United States, and in particular by Victoria Nuland, who is the Undersecretary of State for European Affairs or something like that, who's not only married to a major neoconservative thinker. I guess is it Fred Kagan? I always get the Kagans mixed up. Robert Kagan or Fred Kagan. I think maybe Fred, who's an advisor to Clinton, Hillary Clinton. She was put in her post by Hillary Clinton, even though at this point Clinton was out of that office. She left at the end of the first Obama term. This is 2014. But her people are still behind. We have a phone call that was leaked. We have a tape of a phone call that was played many, many times back in that day about Nuland's talking about who the successor to the Russian-friendly president should be. This guy Yats. They said Yats is the man. That's his nickname. Forget his full name. Yats something or other.
Yatsenyuk.
Yatsenyuk, that's right. So, and all that happened. And then you also had neo-Nazis involved in the demonstrations and other, goings on, far-right groups that have, used Nazi symbols. I mean, this is documented in pictures in the New York Times and other places, about all this. All this is going on. They drive this, democratically elected president who may well have been corrupt and not a good guy. I'm not praising him. They drive him from office, even though he was making sounds of conciliation toward the various opponents at the time when he was still in office, talking about maybe a new constitution, a new election a year from then. He was making, sounds, whether he was sincere, I don't know, but, nobody bothered to find out. They basically helped to drive him from office, again, the U.S., drive him from office, and put in people friendly to NATO and the Economic Union and therefore the United States. Ukraine, one thing it seemed that the president wanted to do in Ukraine was to have a foot in each camp, be friendly with the EU, but also not burn bridges to Russia. I mean, there's the economic reasons regarding, natural gas and loans that Putin was willing to make. And so he was trying to juggle both things and maybe be on good terms with both. But the EU, backed by the US and NATO, seemed to be insisting that no, you're either with us or you're not with us. And that kind of thing was, again, provocative. Russia, Crimea, which is now part of Ukraine and has been since '54 when Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine, even though Ukraine was a Soviet republic. But traditionally, Crimea has been part of Russia, and they've had a base there under lease for a very, very long time. It's their warm water port, which Russia, of course, has always lacked. It's always been a big issue in Russian history. And if NATO and the EU totally bring Ukraine into its orbit, Russia naturally is going to worry. Putin is naturally going to worry about what happens to our bases there. NATO is now going to be right there at our base, our big naval base. So this couldn't help but be provocative, whether you like Putin or not. If you're going to play power politics like this, don't be surprised when there's a response on the other side, and don't make it make it out to be only their fault, as if the U.S. hands are totally clean and we were just minding our own business, because that's not what's going on. I believe the U.S. policymakers knowingly tried to push Putin into a corner. I don't know that what happened is exactly what they wanted to happen. I hope they didn't want to expect a war, but there's not been an invasion by Russia of anybody. There's been allegations that some troops had crossed the border into Ukraine when there was bombings and thousands of people were being killed in eastern Ukraine by the Kiev forces. So yeah, did they come over to help? Maybe they did. I don't know. I'm not justifying any of that, but I don't think you can look at that stuff out of context, which is what so many people want to do, what the U.S. policymakers and the neoconservatives want to do. They just want to look at Putin's conduct as if it's just happening in a vacuum and saying, look what this bad guy's up to. He's out to conquer the world and reconstitute the Soviet Union. That is nonsense. He's not out to conquer the world. He doesn't have the means. His military budget's a small fraction of the American budget, but America spends, half of what's spent worldwide on the military. He's got it's a tiny budget compared to ours. It's even being cut now. I think there was some build up and now being cut back because their economy is not in very good shape. So you have to look at these things all in context, and the demonization of Putin is absurd. And I agree with Stephen Cohen, this great Soviet scholar from Princeton and NYU, who's been saying that you can dislike Trump as much as you want, and I am no fan of Trump. I've criticized him all over the place, but it's outrageous that he cannot even raise the question of why should we be in a Cold War with Russia without it being asked whether he's a Putin agent. That is really destructive of free speech and open inquiry. We ought to be discussing these issues as an election, especially an election year. What should the U.S. be in this antagonistic position versus Russia and provoking Russia? That we ought to be able to talk about that. Notice when Putin talks about Russia, he never talks about NATO and the U.S. provoking Russia. He never puts things in those terms. He just says, why can't we be friendly with Russia and say fight ISIS together? He doesn't ever want to say the U.S. has provoked Russia. with the expansion of NATO, because the reason he can't do that is his whole theme is we're the victims. He can never put the U.S. in the position of the bully because he thinks we're the ones being bullied, which is not true. But so he misses the point. He misses the whole analysis. Maybe he doesn't even know it. I don't know. He may know it and not be able to say it. But the point is, it's not in any of his statements that it's the U.S. that has been pushing Russia up against, into the corner and thinking there's not going to be any response. And yet it's very serious. Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons pointed at us, just like we have a lot of nuclear weapons pointed at them. We ought to be talking about dismantling those things, not provoking them into taking action, which, from their point of view, is purely defensive.
Right, and on the Stephen Cohen subject, there's this great clip, and I'll link to it at the show notes page, wakeupcallpodcast.com/NATO. But he was on CNN with Michael Smerconish a week or two ago, and there's this great clip of Smerconish pushing all of the regular talking points, and Cohen batting them down one after another, and then after 5 minutes, Smerconish is so overwhelmed they have to cut to commercial and end the interview. So I'll link to that. But last question for you before we wrap up.
Sure.
It seems unlikely, at least here in the near future, that NATO will be disbanded and that we will see the nuclear disarmament that you and I might hope for. So where do you think this is headed instead? What sorts of changes do you think we'll see in NATO? Or are we going to see even further NATO expansion? Or are we going to see a further repurposing of NATO? Is NATO going to be involved in a larger way in Syria? Or are we going to see this new Cold War further develop? Could we have a hot war? Where do you think this is all headed?
Prognostication is not my strong suit, so it's very hard to say. Don't forget, there are talks between Obama and Putin, or at least their representatives, over Syria. So while I don't think the U.S. should be involved in the Middle East, and Syria in particular, but the Middle East generally, if it is involved, I'm glad they're talking, because I don't want a war to break out in Syria between the United States and Russia. There are planes flying from each country, and there are personnel nearby, and so I certainly do not want to be a flashpoint which then escalates into something horrible. So if they're talking, I guess that's good. I'd rather the U.S. just get out, but if it's not getting out, at least they're talking. I guess they're talking about some maybe joint operation against ISIS around Aleppo or something in Syria. That's what I hear. Just on the news. I mean, this is being just widely reported. So that may tend to, stabilize things or diffuse tensions between Russia and the United States. But if you shift back to Europe, I just don't know. I mean, it could get bad. I mean, we don't always know, and we don't always know what individual rulers will do that maybe the U.S. would not want them to do, but they do it anyway. I mean, we didn't talk a whole lot about Georgia, but one of the problems with that war in Georgia in, 2008, was of course you have disputed territory on the border between Georgia and provinces, or whatever they call them, between Georgia and Russia. But the president there was a little bit emboldened by George W. Bush's what seemed to be a guarantee, like we have your back, although then Bush didn't do anything. But the president there might have felt like, hey, I can push the Russians a little bit. I got the Americans in my camp here, in my corner. And so it's possible that some local ruler could set something off that the U.S. wouldn't have wanted, but it feels a little cocky because, hey, I got the U.S. NATO's behind me, even if I'm not formally a member of NATO. So we got to worry that something like that could happen, and hopefully cooler heads would prevail and it wouldn't escalate. But it makes it very risky to predict, because it could go either way. Things could get better, but things could turn sour also.
Well, we definitely live in uncertain times and scary times at that.
For sure.
So thank you for joining me today to discuss NATO and take a closer look at NATO and all the issues that go with it. What are the best ways to follow your work, and what readings and resources do you recommend someone check out if they want to learn more about what we've been discussing today?
Well, you've given my blog URL. It's just sheldonrichman.com. That's RICHMAN, sheldonrichman.com. It's called Free Association. So my stuff will appear there first. Often it then is picked up by Reason Magazine, antiwar.com. I would watch antiwar.com on a regular basis as far as if you want to see what people are saying and very good analysis about NATO. I mean, they run very good analytical pieces. Every day they'll link to analytical pieces as well as running original material, so it's just worth checking each day. Another good place to look for really solid analysis is consortiumnews.com. Consortiumnews.com. I can't think of a book offhand, but I think if you watch Anti-War and Consortium News, and also you can find some good stuff at counterpunch.com. Also, you'll be led to good sources of information.
Okay, well, that sounds good, and I want to remind everybody that the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/NATO, and, of course, there will be links to sheldonrichman.com and all of the books and articles and resources we've referenced over the course of this interview, including the article, The Real NATO Problem, Not Who Should Fund It, But Why It Even Exists, as well as your most recent book, America's Counter-Revolution, The Constitution Revisited. So that and more, along with all of the appropriate Facebook and Twitter links at wakeupcallpodcast.com/NATO, with that being the show notes page for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher, as well as to sign up for our email list, which can be found on the website, both of which will allow you to stay up to date with what's going on with the show and to make sure you don't miss an episode. So, Sheldon, on that note, thanks for being so generous with your time today, and thanks for joining me to explore a very important subject that's been in the news a lot lately, but doesn't usually have the proper context to go along with it.
Well, you're welcome. I certainly enjoyed it, and honored that you asked me, and hope we talk again.
Okay, definitely.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.